44 tank cars, 1 marshalling yard, 90 seconds of chain detonation that Russian logistics planners in the southern grouping are still trying to explain. This is the story of how a Ukrainian drone swarm turned a fortified fuel depot into a pressure wave that erased months of Russian operational planning in a single night. Not through superior numbers or overwhelming force, through precision, patience, and a targeting doctrine that Russian point defense systems were never designed to stop. I'm your host at Ukraine Radar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. The Voronezh rail marshalling yard was not a secret. It was, in the language of Russian logistics, a node of confidence. A place that moved fuel south toward occupied territories with the quiet regularity of a machine that believed itself untouchable. Tank cars staged there in rows, each carrying diesel or aviation fuel, or the heavy petroleum products that Russian armored formations consume at rates that would bankrupt a mid-sized nation. The yard had point defense emplacements, jamming infrastructure, radar coverage that the Russian Southern Military District listed in its threat assessments as adequate. More than adequate. They were wrong about adequate. Because the Ukrainian strike planners who spent weeks mapping this facility were not targeting the individual tank cars. They were targeting the loading manifold, the pressure junction through which all those cars received their fuel. 1 point. 1 vulnerability. 1 strike that would not simply destroy what was there, but ignite what surrounded it. In the days before the strike, Ukrainian military intelligence had assembled a targeting package representing some of the most precise OSINT-driven analysis of the war's current phase. Satellite passes, multiple agencies, multiple orbital inclinations, had mapped the yard's layout with centimeter-level accuracy. The loading manifold position, the distances between tank cars during peak staging, the rotation schedule that brought the fullest, heaviest cars to the southern rail spur on predictable nights. Ukrainian sources estimate the intelligence cycle for this operation ran for over 6 weeks before a strike window was authorized. What made this target different from the dozens of Russian fuel facilities Ukrainian forces had struck before was the yard's redundancy reputation. Russian logisticians had built Voronezh's marshalling infrastructure precisely because earlier strikes had degraded forward area fuel nodes across occupied territories. This depot appeared in intercepted communications, later corroborated by satellite imagery analysis, as the last fully functional redundant node on the southern supply arc. Strike everything forward of it and the tanks still ran. Strike this, and Russian armored formations in the south would be drawing from emergency reserves within 72 hours. That was the strategic weight of what Ukrainian planners were looking at. The question was never whether to strike it. The question was how to get through. Which weapon was deadlier in penetrating the Voronezh air defense network? A. HIMARS precision rockets. B. Loitering munitions. C. Coordinated drone swarm? Comment your answer below. We'll break down the tactical logic as the story develops. The yard's air defense architecture was layered in a way that reflected Russian lessons learned from earlier Ukrainian deep strike campaigns. Pantsir S-1 point defense systems covered the approach corridors from the northwest and southwest, the directions from which Ukrainian long-range drones had historically approached Voronezh Oblast. Electronic warfare emitters, including a Krasukha 4 derivative system repositioned to cover the rail infrastructure, generated a jamming envelope that degraded GPS-guided munitions on approach vectors below 300 meters altitude. The Russians had also positioned IR search sensors along the rail perimeter. Passive detection that didn't signal its presence to Ukrainian SIGINT and waited silently for thermal signatures moving low against the terrain. On paper, this was a serious defensive architecture, not impenetrable. Ukrainian planners never believed anything was impenetrable, but serious enough to require a specific solution. The solution was Doctrine. Ukraine's deep strike swarm concept, refined across multiple operations against hardened Russian targets, rests on a single asymmetric truth. Point defense systems are built for single or small group threat vectors. They calculate intercept geometry, prioritize the highest velocity or highest altitude threat, and respond assuming that a handful of incoming contacts is the whole attack. When the attack is instead 42 coordinated contacts arriving from 4 separate compass bearings at staggered altitudes and intervals, the intercept calculation breaks. The Pantsir system has a finite engagement magazine. The radar has a finite track capacity. The crew has finite cognitive bandwidth. Overwhelm all 3 simultaneously, and the defensive architecture that looks formidable on a briefing slide becomes a loading manifold of its own. 1 pressure point, and the whole system seizes. Stay with me, because what unfolds in the next 18 minutes of this strike permanently rewrites how Russian logistics commanders think about rear area infrastructure protection. The launch sequence for the Voronezh strike involved platforms that Ukrainian sources have not fully disclosed, consistent with operational security around their deep strike drone fleet. What OSINT analysis and subsequent Russian damage reports allow us to reconstruct is the general contour of the attack profile. The primary strike element consisted of modified long-range strike UAVs. Variants of the Ukrainian domestic production line refined since the earliest days of the Deep Strike campaign. These are not the small FPV kamikaze drones that Ukrainian crews deploy against Russian armor at the front. These are purpose-built platforms with range measured in the hundreds of kilometers, warhead packages selected for specific target effects, and navigation redundancy that reduces, though does not eliminate, the degradation imposed by Russian electronic warfare. The secondary element was a suppression of defense package, a wave of smaller, cheaper drones whose mission was not to reach the target, but to force the Pantsir systems to expend intercept missiles on non-critical contacts, depleting the magazine before the primary wave arrived. This is not a new concept. It's the same logic that anti-radiation missiles use against radar systems, applied to the finite missile supply of a point defense battery. Force the gun to shoot at nothing, then send what matters. The obstacle the Ukrainian strike planners had not fully anticipated became apparent approximately 40 minutes before the launch window. A forward Krasukha-type jamming system, the one identified by SIGINT as covering the northwest approach corridor, had repositioned. Not far. Perhaps 3 kilometers from its surveyed location. Enough, though, to shift its jamming cone onto the primary approach vector that the lead strike element was programmed to use. The Ukrainian reconnaissance team tracking the system's emission signature reported the displacement via secure channel. The strike coordinator had 40 minutes to decide: abort the window, reprogram the lead wave's approach, geometry, or accept the degraded navigation environment and proceed. They reprogrammed. Not the entire swarm. That would have required more time than the window allowed. The lead element of 8 primary strike UAVs received updated navigation waypoints that added 14 kilometers to their approach path, routing them south of the jamming cone's coverage zone before turning northeast toward the target. The suppression wave, whose navigation was less GPS dependent, proceeded on the original vector. 14 extra kilometers, 11 additional minutes of flight time, and a closing geometry that would bring the primary strike element in from the southeast, a direction for which the Pantsir systems had no pre-registered engagement zones. The Russian point defense crews had prepared for what they expected. They had not prepared for what they were going to get. Subscribe to Ukraine Radar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happens next is not in any Russian defensive doctrine manual. The suppression wave arrived first. 34 smaller UAVs. Drone operators and analysts have described them from combat footage as a mix of platform types, some clearly commercial derivative, some purpose-built, came in from 3 directions across a 7-minute window. The Pantsir batteries engaged. This is documented in Russian air defense reporting that filtered through military channels in the days following the strike, subsequently identified and analyzed by open-source investigators tracking the depot's status. The northwestern Pantsir battery expended 11 missiles in the suppression wave engagement. The southwestern battery expended 9. Combined, 20 intercepts against 34 incoming contacts. Not a catastrophic failure by the standards of a conventional saturation attack, but enough. Enough because the math of magazine depletion works against the defender in asymmetric swarm doctrine. Each Pantsir S-1 carries 12 surface-to-air missiles in ready launch configuration. Fire 9 or 11 of them against a suppression wave, and what remains for the primary strike is 3 or 1, not 0. But close enough that the intercept envelope against a second wave arriving from an unregistered azimuth, at a time when the crew is cycling through their reload assessment, updating their track picture, reporting to command, is effectively 0. The primary strike wave arrived from the southeast 8 minutes after the suppression wave's last contact. 8 UAVs. 4 designated for the loading manifold directly. 2 designated for the rail junction infrastructure, the switching systems that controlled car movement within the yard. 2 designated as redundant. If the first 4 achieved the manifold hit, the redundant pair would shift targeting to the fuel transfer pumping station adjacent to the main manifold structure. Combat footage captured from one of the monitoring drones, subsequently verified and analyzed by Ukrainian military sources, shows the first manifold impact at 3:17 a.m. local time. The warhead detonated inside the manifold structure rather than on its surface, a function of the delayed fuse configuration selected specifically for this target type. The immediate explosion was smaller than observers might have expected from a strike of this planning complexity. What came next was not small. The loading manifold was under pressure at the time of the strike. This matters enormously. A fuel manifold under operational pressure, when breached by an internal detonation, does not simply rupture. It jets. It sprays pressurized fuel in a radius determined by the breach geometry and the internal pressure at the moment of failure. That fuel, atomized by the pressure differential, does not flow. It disperses as a fine aerosol across the surrounding area. The tank cars positioned along the loading spur, full cars waiting for their southbound run, were within the dispersal radius. Dispersed fuel aerosol is not liquid. It does not require sustained ignition to burn. It requires a single thermal event. The second manifold strike, arriving 4 seconds after the first, provided that event. How many tank cars did the chain detonation ultimately involve? A. 31 cars. B. 44 cars. C. 52 cars. Remember this question. We'll give you the answer and the full damage assessment before the end of this video. The chain detonation sequence at the Voronezh marshalling yard is described in Ukrainian General Staff reports as beginning with the third tank car from the loading manifold position and propagating outward along both staging tracks simultaneously. The thermal event from the second manifold strike ignited the fuel aerosol cloud, which had expanded in the seconds between the two impacts to cover an area approximately 60 meters in diameter. This initial fireball reached the surface of the nearest staged tank cars, not through an explosion, but through radiant heat transfer, sufficient to compromise the pressure relief systems of cars that were themselves under loading pressure. Once those first cars vented and their contents ignited, the chain reaction was no longer a drone strike. It was a fuel fire with its own propagation logic. The Russian emergency response, a combination of rail yard fire suppression equipment and a crash call to the nearest municipal fire service, arrived at the outer perimeter of the yard approximately 19 minutes after the first manifold impact. By that point, the fire had reached 11 tank cars on the eastern staging track and 9 on the western. The suppression capability on hand was insufficient for a pressurized fuel fire of this magnitude. What the responding crews could do, and what they did, was establish a control line to prevent the fire from propagating to the northern section of the yard where unstaged empty cars and maintenance equipment were stored. They held that line. The southern staging tracks burned. Satellite imagery analysis published by open-source researchers in the days following the strike, cross-referenced against the rail yard's pre-strike configuration mapped from commercial satellite passes, identified 44 tank cars as total losses. The number is not an estimate born of imprecision. The pre-strike imagery showed the yard's southern staging tracks at capacity. 47 cars, of which 44 were full cars in pre-departure staging. The 3 cars that survived the fire were at the far northern end of the western track, beyond the reach of the propagating thermal event. 44 cars. At standard capacity for the type of tank cars documented in the imagery. Russian-operated petroleum tank cars of the type used on this rail corridor hold approximately 60 metric tons of fuel each. This represents approximately 2,640 metric tons of fuel destroyed in a single strike package. If you believe tactical innovation defeats numerical superiority, type Ukraine radar in the comments. Ukraine keeps proving it. For the Russian Southern Military District's operational tempo, this number translates directly into military effect. Ukrainian military analysts, in assessments shared through Ukrainian General Staff channels, estimated that the destroyed fuel quantity represented approximately 4 to 6 days of operational consumption for the Russian armored formations dependent on the southern supply arc, not catastrophic in isolation. But the Voronezh depot had been described, in those intercepted communications referenced earlier, as the last fully redundant node. Its degradation did not simply remove 4 to 6 days of supply. It removed the redundancy buffer that allowed Russian planners to absorb interdiction of forward area fuel points without operational disruption. With Voronezh's capacity destroyed, the next nearest staging facility capable of handling this volume of fuel was approximately 200 kilometers further north. A longer logistic arc, more exposed to interdiction, with rail transit times that added an additional day and a half to the supply cycle. Russian fuel trains running that arc had to travel through territory that Ukrainian long-range systems had already demonstrated the ability to strike. The extended arc was not a solution. It was a problem that had to be managed. Intercepted Russian communications in the period following the strike. Fragments analyzed by Ukrainian SIGINT and referenced in General Staff reporting reveal the specific texture of the command-level response. The initial confusion was not about what had happened. The fire was visible for 30 kilometers. The confusion was about how it had happened. The Pantsir batteries had engaged. The jamming envelope had been active. The radar coverage had been functioning. How had 8 primary strike UAVs reached the manifold through a defensive architecture that had been assessed as adequate? The Russian Southern Military District's after-action process, reconstructed from the communications fragments, focused heavily on the repositioning of the Krasukha-type system in the hours before the strike. The move intended to strengthen the defensive posture, shifting the jamming cone to cover the northwest approach, had, in the zero-sum geometry of electronic warfare coverage, uncovered the southeast approach. The adaptation meant to address a vulnerability had created one. This is the defining irony of Russia's air defense adaptation problem. The Ukrainian deep strike program has been running long enough and striking targets across a wide enough geographic arc that Russian commanders are forced to continuously adjust their air defense postures. Every adjustment is a calculation made under uncertainty, covering one axis while accepting risk on another. The Ukrainian strike planners are not simply targeting infrastructure. They are targeting the decision-making process itself, forcing Russian commanders into a game of coverage geometry they cannot win because they have finite assets and infinite perimeter to protect. The Voronezh manifold strike demonstrated this at scale. Not because the Ukrainian planners knew in advance that the Krasukha system would reposition. They did not. But because they built into the strike plan, through the 40-minute pre-launch reprogram, the adaptive capacity to respond when the geometry changed. A rigid strike plan against a repositioned defense fails. A doctrine that treats repositioning as an expected variable and builds in the time and communication architecture to respond succeeds. What would NATO logistics doctrine have done differently to protect a critical node like this? Comment your analysis. This is exactly the kind of defensive planning problem NATO planners are now running war games on. The question of point defense adequacy for high-value fixed infrastructure is not settled by the Voronezh strike. But the strike adds a significant data point to a pattern that Russian planners can no longer dismiss. The Pantsir system, in point defense configuration, has a finite engagement capacity. Saturation tactics, sending more contacts than the battery can handle, are not new. What is relatively new in this conflict is the Ukrainian ability to combine saturation with approach vector manipulation, routing the high-value strike element through the coverage gap that saturation created. This is not improvised, it is doctrine. And its application at Voronezh against a target believed to be among the better defended nodes in the rear area demonstrates that the doctrine has matured. For Russian logistics commanders, the implications are uncomfortable. If point defense is insufficient, and Voronezh suggests it is, against a strike package of this sophistication, the alternative is either thickening the air defense density around every high-value node to a level that Russian air defense production rates cannot sustain, or accepting that Ukrainian deep strike capability will continue to find and exploit the coverage gaps that any realistic defensive architecture generates. Russian air defense production has not kept pace with attrition. This is documented across multiple OSINT tracking projects monitoring Russian defense industrial output. The Pantsir batteries at Voronezh cannot be immediately replaced with fresh batteries. The 20 missiles expended in the suppression wave engagement draw from a supply chain already under pressure from production constraints exacerbated by sanctions on critical electronic components. Chinese dual-use component supply has partially offset some of these constraints, providing guidance, electronics, and certain seeker components that Russian domestic production can no longer source freely. But partial offset is not full replacement, and the production mathematics do not favor the defender. This is the heart of what makes this strike more than a single operational success. The Voronezh rail marshalling yard was targeted not because destroying it would win the war, but because destroying it would compound pressure on a southern logistics system already operating at the edge of its tolerance. Every node that Ukrainian deep strike removes from that system forces Russian planners to run longer, more exposed arcs. Longer arcs mean more fuel consumed in transit. More fuel consumed in transit means net delivery to forward formation shrinks even before Ukrainian interdiction is applied to the arc itself. It is a compounding problem, and each successful deep strike makes the next strike's strategic value higher. This is not a coincidence of target selection. It is targeting doctrine applied with cumulative effect. The Ukrainian deep strike program's evolution since the early phases of the conflict has been precisely this: a shift from opportunistic strikes against targets of immediate tactical value towards systematic campaign-level interdiction designed to degrade the logistic foundation of Russian offensive capability. The Voronezh manifold strike represents that doctrine at its most refined, targeting not what carries the fuel, but what enables the carrying. The loading manifold, the pressure point, the node whose destruction does not simply damage the system, but restructures the geometry of how the system must operate. The strike team responsible for this operation, drone operators whose names and unit designations are not publicly disclosed for operational security reasons, executed a mission that required weeks of intelligence preparation, a real-time adaptation under time pressure, and a targeting precision that turned a defended industrial facility into a chain detonation sequence that burned for over 6 hours. Ukrainian sources report 0 casualties in the strike unit. The platforms are expensive relative to FPV drones. Estimates for long-range strike UAVs of this class run between $50,000 and $150,000 per unit. But against a target whose loss is valued at the operational capability it removes from Russian southern forces, the cost calculus is not close. 8 platforms, 1 loading manifold, 44 tank cars, a logistic arc restructured for months. The obstacle that nearly derailed the strike, the late repositioning of the Krasukha system, deserves one more moment of examination, because the adaptation that Ukrainian coordinators executed in the 40-minute window before launch represents something that Russian doctrine would not easily replicate. The ability to replan approach geometry for a subset of a swarm strike, in real time, on a compressed timeline, without losing the coordination between the primary and suppression elements. This is not a technical capability alone. It is an organizational capability. It requires communication protocols, planning flexibility, and command authority pushed down to the level where decisions can be made fast. Have you ever wondered what the real difference is between an adaptive military and a rigid one? It is not equipment. It is not numbers. It is this. Who is allowed to make the call when the situation changes, and how fast can they make it? Comment below. Do you think command flexibility is the decisive factor in modern warfare? Or is it still technology that wins? Russian military culture, structured around vertical command authority and strict procedural adherence, has consistently struggled with exactly this kind of real-time adaptation. The repositioning of the Krasukha system before the strike was an adaptation, a Russian commander responding to perceived threat evolution by adjusting a defensive asset. That adaptation was technically correct in its logic. It was a reasonable move. But it was made without a corresponding update to the strike package planning that would have been required to make it effective, because the broader system, the communication between the jamming unit commander and the Pantsir battery commanders and the radar coverage assessment, did not generate a revised integrated air defense picture in time for anyone to notice the coverage gap it created. The Russian air defense system that night was defended by people making individually rational decisions that the system failed to integrate. The Ukrainian strike system was operated by people empowered to make collectively adaptive decisions that the system supported. In the aftermath of the Voronezh strike, Russian repair and restoration efforts focused immediately on the loading manifold infrastructure. The manifold itself was destroyed beyond field expedient repair. Ukrainian warhead selection for this strike had prioritized structural damage to the manifold housing rather than simple thermal effect, ensuring that the facility would require replacement components rather than simply repair fire damage. Replacement components for the type of Soviet-era loading infrastructure used at this facility are not readily available in the current Russian industrial environment. Sanctions have complicated the supply chain for certain valve and seeker components. Domestic alternatives exist, but require lead times measured in weeks, not days. The rail yard was restored to partial operation, handling empty cars in transit and non-fuel freight, within approximately 10 days of the strike, according to satellite imagery analysis. Full fuel loading operations did not resume at the affected manifold within the observation window available to open-source researchers. The northern section of the yard, which had been protected from the fire by the emergency response perimeter, continued to function. But the southern staging tracks, the high-throughput section that handled the volume destined for the southern supply arc, remained out of service. What this means operationally is that the Russian Southern Military District absorbed the full effect of the strike for at least the period required to establish alternative supply routing. Ukrainian HIMARS strikes against the extended northern supply arc in the weeks following the Voronezh strike, documented in combat footage and Ukrainian general staff reporting, added compounding pressure to that alternative routing. The disruption was not temporary relief from logistic pressure. It was the beginning of a sustained period of elevated difficulty for Russian fuel supply to the south. Will Ukraine's deep strike campaign against Russian logistics eventually degrade Russian offensive capability enough to force a strategic shift? Comment YES or NO. This is the central operational question of the current phase, and we want to know what our audience thinks. The broader tactical lesson of the Voronezh manifold strike operates on 2 levels. The first is the technical level, the architecture of the strike itself, the suppression then precision sequence, the approach vector manipulation, the manifold first targeting philosophy that turned a defended industrial yard into a chain detonation event. These are lessons that will be studied in military doctrine schools for years, because they represent asymmetric swarm principles applied against hardened, fixed infrastructure in a way that achieved effects far disproportionate to the cost of the strike package. The second level is strategic, the selection of the target itself. and what it tells us about how Ukrainian military planners are thinking about the logistic war. The shift from targeting forward fuel points, which Russia can recover from quickly by drawing on rear area reserves, to targeting the rear area nodes themselves, and specifically targeting the redundancy architecture that makes rear area fuel supply resilient, represents a maturation of Ukrainian deep strike doctrine that Russian planning staffs are struggling to counter. You cannot defend everything. You cannot predict exactly which node will be struck next. But you can predict that the targeting logic will continue to follow the redundancy map, because the Ukrainian targeting planners are reading the same logistic geography that Russian planners are reading, and they are finding the same pressure points. Real tactics. Real consequences. Ukraine radar. The Russian military has invested heavily in point defense for rear area infrastructure since earlier phases of this conflict. That investment is not wasted. It has intercepted strikes that would otherwise have reached their targets, and it has forced Ukrainian planners to develop increasingly sophisticated attack profiles to penetrate defended airspace. But the Voronezh strike demonstrates that point defense, however capable, does not solve the fundamental problem posed by swarm plus saturation doctrine against fixed infrastructure. The magazine is finite. The approach vectors are infinite. The suppression wave cost is low. The primary strike platform cost, while not trivial, is a fraction of the value of the target it destroys. This asymmetry, cheap suppression, expensive defense, catastrophic infrastructure loss, is the defining economic equation of the current phase of the drone war. Russian air defense procurement cannot scale fast enough to close it. Ukrainian deep strike production, supported by domestic manufacturing capacity that has expanded significantly across the conflict's duration, can sustain strike tempo faster than Russian defensive architecture can adapt. That is not a permanent advantage. Wars evolve, doctrines respond, technologies shift. But in this operational moment, it is the advantage that Ukrainian planners are exploiting, and the Voronezh manifold strike is perhaps the clearest single-event illustration of how that exploitation works at its most effective. The marshalling yard at Voronezh is quieter now, not silent. Rail yards are never silent. But the southern staging tracks that once held rows of full tank cars ready for the southern run look different than they did before. The loading manifold is gone. The infrastructure that turned crude supply into military operational fuel at scale, at the pace the Russian Southern Military District required, is degraded. What runs south now runs on a longer arc, at slower tempo, with less redundancy. That is what 44 tank cars detonating in chain reaction buys. Not victory. Not the end of Russian fuel supply to the south, but a compounding of pressure on a system already under pressure, applied at exactly the point where the system was most confident in its own defense. And now for the answer to our tactical quiz from earlier in the video. How many tank cars did the chain detonation ultimately involve? The answer is B, 44 cars. Satellite imagery analysis cross-referenced against pre-strike mapping of the southern staging tracks identified 47 cars in pre-departure staging at the time of the strike. 44 were assessed as total losses. The 3 survivors were at the far northern end of the western track, beyond the fire's propagation reach. At 60 metric tons capacity each, the destruction represented approximately 2,640 metric tons of fuel removed from Russian southern supply. The equivalent of 4 to 6 days of operational consumption for the armored formations dependent on this depot. 3 questions for you to carry forward. Was targeting the loading manifold rather than the individual tank cars the correct doctrine choice? The chain detonation argues yes, but consider what might have happened if the manifold strike had been partial, if the pressure differential had been lower, if the fuel aerosol had not dispersed far enough to reach the staged cars. A manifold first strike is a high-risk, high-reward targeting decision that succeeds spectacularly when conditions align and potentially underperforms when they do not. Could the Russian point defense architecture at Voronezh have prevented this strike with different configuration choices? The suppression wave then primary sequence exploits finite magazine capacity. A heavier Pantsir deployment, 2 batteries per approach corridor rather than 1, might have changed the intercept mathematics. But 2 batteries per corridor, for every high-value fixed infrastructure node in the rear area, exceeds Russian air defense deployment capacity across the current frontline and rear area geography simultaneously. And the question that Russian logistics commanders are now living with every day: what would you have done differently in the 40-minute window before the strike, when the Krasukha system repositioned and the strike coordinator on the Ukrainian side was already reprogramming approach waypoints? Was there a decision available to the Russian command structure in that window that could have closed the southeast approach corridor? Or was the adaptive gap, The institutional inability to integrate a last-minute defensive adjustment into a revised air defense picture in real time. The decisive vulnerability that no individual commander could have overcome? Subscribe to Ukraine Radar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The southern staging tracks are quiet now, but the wrecks remain. 44 tank cars, fused by chain detonation into wreckage that no repair team can restore. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes fixed assumptions. About defense adequacy, about redundancy sufficiency, about the magazine mathematics of point defense against adaptive swarm doctrine. Without mercy and without exception. Stay vigilant.